Psychological egoism. So when I was in the grocery store the other day, I donated $5 to buy a bag of food that feeds the homeless or the hungry. Why did I do that? What was my deepest motivation? According to the psychological egoists, my deepest motivation was about me. It's about the self somehow. Maybe I did it to look good, or maybe I just did it because donating to them and helping other people out gives me pleasure. And since it gives me pleasure, the psychological egoist argues, it's all about me in the end. And that's what this video is about. It's about psychological egoism, the idea that it's all about me, all about the self in the end. The deepest motivations are all about self. Now, I made previous videos on psychological egoism, but they're mostly about the verbal debate, with the words selfish and self-interest and so on. This video is going to get into the more substantive arguments on both sides. So the question is this: is everyone always selfish, self-interested, or egoistic? Whatever vocabulary you wish to use, are all my motivations ultimately about me? Again, psychological egoists believe, yes, they are. They believe that the strongest forms of altruism are impossible because self-interest is the only thing that ultimately motivates human beings. But every introductory to ethics textbook that you read argues against psychological egoism, and there's now scientific evidence against it too. So why do they argue against it? What's really going on here? Why is it important? So again, in this video, I'll move beyond the verbal debate and start getting into all these different arguments. Section 1 will define egoism, okay, and introduce one type of debate. Section 2 will introduce important distinctions and evaluate 3 arguments for psychological egoism from Russ Schaefer-Landau in his book, The Fundamentals of Ethics. And then Section 3 will look at the scientific research. So let's start with the definition. Psychological egoism is the position that there's only one thing that motivates us human beings, self-interest. So if psychological egoism is true, then one form of altruism, the direct desire to benefit another person for their own sake without any ulterior motive, that form of altruism does not exist if psychological egoism is true. Now, psychological egoists believe that every person is not only self-interested, but always self-interested. Right? That's a very important distinction. Many of them are confident that there's no way around it. Everyone is always self-interested or always egoistic. Right? Notice that psychological egoism is different from the other theories that you might read about in an ethics book. And it's different because it's not trying to identify principles that you can choose or that make an action right or wrong. Rather, psychological egoism claims to describe how people actually are. It's a descriptive theory, not a prescriptive theory. So psychological egoism claims everyone is self-interested, whereas ethical egoism, a different theory we're not talking about here, claims everyone should be self-interested. Right? So egoism is about is, not should. It's also important to remember that psychological egoism is not about whether being self-interested or selfish or whatever. It's not about whether that's morally good or bad. It simply explores whether everyone actually is self-interested. It's a descriptive theory. So to clarify the meaning one last time, let's turn to the scientific research, especially that done by Batson. Here's how he defines the egoism problem here before testing it. He says, altruism is the motivational state with the ultimate goal of increasing another's welfare, and egoism is a motivational state with the ultimate goal of increasing one's own welfare. So psychological egoism is the position that altruism as a motivational state, that's very important, that form of altruism is impossible. Egoism is the only motivational state that exists in humans. And so this is precisely what the psychological egoist, at least the intelligent psychological egoist, believes. This is the strongest form. Now, I really like this definition because it's clear and it avoids the mostly verbal debate, which happens when you get into words like selfish, self-interest, and so on. Understanding the verbal debate is important, as I explored in previous videos, but it won't ultimately solve this problem, at least not at a deep level. So this video will focus more on the substantive arguments and scientific evidence and so on. So as we proceed, keep 2 more points in mind. First, remember the psychological egoist is claiming everyone is always selfish or self-interested or egoistic. It's always about the self. There's a certain kind of altruistic motivation that's impossible, just like round squares are impossible. They're not saying people are mostly self-interested. They're saying they always are. More precisely, they're saying our deepest motives are always self-interested. And here's the second point. Notice that it's really important to distinguish between the source of desire and the object of desire as we proceed. For example, if psychological egoism is false, then my desire may come from me, but the object of my desire may solely or partially be for the welfare of another human being. So if psychological egoism is false, I do not want the welfare of the other human being because it will benefit me somehow, right? But I simply want the welfare of the other, at least some of the time. So the fact that I have a desire and that this desire is mine is not what makes me self-interested or altruistic. Rather, it's the object of my desire that makes me self-interested or altruistic. Again, the psychological egoist believes that the object of my desire is always myself or my pleasure that I'm seeking or something that benefits myself. I do it because I will benefit in some way. The person who rejects psychological egoism believes that the object of one's desire is not always and ultimately aimed at self-welfare or self-pleasure, but it's sometimes aimed at the welfare of another for their own sake. So now that the meaning of psychological egoism is clear, which is a big hurdle, by the way, let's move to the distinctions and the arguments. Okay, before we get to the three major arguments, let's get to some minor arguments and clarifications. Okay, so there are many actions that seem to be evidence against psychological egoism. You can find some of these at carnegiehero.org. So people jump on grenades, they give to charities, they jump into freezing waters to save other people, and so on. It seems like they're not acting in their own self-interest alone. Rather, they're acting in the interest of others, either completely or partially. But if psychological egoism is true, that's wrong. So if psychological egoism is true, every single hero was driven by self-interest or individual welfare to save the lives of others. The psychological egoist asserts that everything you do is deep down done with the hope for personal gain or for that personal pleasure. So, which is a type of personal gain, you could argue. So psychological egoism creates really entertaining debates in which the non-egoist gives an example of an apparently altruistic act, and the egoist responds by listing possible reasons for why the act is selfish or self-interested, or egoistic is the best word, but I'll use self-interest throughout. Now, for example, the non-egoist says, a soldier jumped in the grenade to save his buddy. See, not all acts are self-interested. Then the egoist says, well, actually, he probably jumped in the grenade because he wanted a reward in the afterlife, he desired to be a hero, or he just could not live with a guilty conscience. So his act is self-interested. The non-egoist then says, well, I give to charity because I want to help people, so my action is not self-interested. The egoist responds and says, well, actually, you give to charity because it makes you feel good. And since it makes you feel good, your act is self-interested. That's what happens in that Friends episode, right? So some people give to charity for tax benefits and other selfish or self-interested motives, right? So this pattern of debate can continue endlessly, and it's very entertaining to watch such discussions unfold. The non-egoist continues by mentioning apparently altruistic acts and people like Jesus, Gandhi, Mother Teresa, and the egoist responds by listing possible self-interested motives or by arguing that Jesus, Gandhi, and Mother Teresa are self-interested because each is obtaining their pleasure in helping others. So in the Friends episode, Joey argues that nice people help others because it makes nice people feel good, and since it makes them feel good, it was selfish or self-interested. So we'll evaluate that poor Friends argument later. But for now, we've explored enough to see how people usually debate psychological egoism. The non-egoist gives apparently altruistic acts and motives, while the egoist lists possible egoist motives in reply. And as the debate unfolds, some people start to sense the superficial nature of the debate. There's something going on. It's full of ambiguities, false dichotomies, and an ignorance of several distinctions. So let's get to some clarifications about egoism before we move on. You know, sometimes people will argue that not everyone is self-interested because some people do not act self-interestedly. So, for example, some people smoke cigarettes, which is not in their long-term self-interest. But this sort of scenario is not a problem for the psychological egoist because the smoker is getting some satisfaction from smoking, and that is why he does it. He's getting something for himself. So he may often fail to do that which is in his long-term self-interest, but that's not a good argument against the idea that he's exclusively motivated by something for himself. Perhaps he's being selfish instead of self-interested, or short-sighted instead of long-sighted, but it's still all about him and about bringing immediate pleasure or long-term welfare to himself. And so egoism withstands this sort of criticism. Now, other people may argue that going to the dentist is not a case of seeking one's own pleasure, and so egoism is false. But the egoist, again, has a good reply. When one goes to the dentist, the person is seeking a self-interested long-term goal for himself or herself. Again, it's all about the self. So psychological egoism is the idea that all human actions are aimed at avoiding some personal loss or gaining some personal benefit, or both, either in the short run, or in the long run, or both. So notice how this sort of discussion clarifies and deepens the means of psychological egoism. So we move from the crude forms to the more intelligent forms. Okay, let's talk for a moment about automatic processes. Now, the important point is that the psychological egoist is concerned with intention, with motive, not with automatic processes. So, for example, I may have a seizure without intending to have a seizure. This is not an argument against egoism, because egoism is only about actions with intentions or motives, at least the form of psychological egoism that we're exploring here. So I may automatically jump on a grenade with no motivation or intention. But this is not an argument for or against egoism, precisely because there was no motive involved. It's only if there's a motive involved that it's relevant. So as Schaefer-Landau explains, psychological egoism is the descriptive thesis that if a person has a motive, an intention, then the intention is ultimately to benefit herself. So to refute psychological egoism, you must provide examples in which a person intends to do something, even though she wasn't trying to benefit herself. And then finally, the last point before these three big arguments come into play is this: why does it matter? Well, why does it matter? That's a good question for all of these philosophy topics, right? Okay. Well, if psychological egoism is true, then we cannot be altruistic. If we cannot be altruistic, then it shouldn't or can't be our duty to be altruistic. Analogously, it should not be my duty to create square circles if it's impossible to do so, right? So we should not morally encourage people to be concerned with others for their own sake and not just how they'll benefit me if it's impossible to do so. So this is why some people argue that morality depends on proving psychological egoism false. What they want to say is that there's no point in a mother telling her child to be more altruistic if it's really impossible for the child to be altruistic. Now, maybe altruism is not always good, but that's a different debate. The debate on psychological egoism is about whether the strongest forms of altruism are even possible. The psychological egoist does not think so. So the debate is not about the morality or immorality of self-interested or altruistic behavior. It's more basic, right? Now, this issue actually seems quite important then. Many people want to know what is true, so they'll be interested in this psychological egoism, right? But it seems too that some central aspects of morality would turn out to be false if psychological egoism is true. So if morality and the highest love, let's say, begins when we start considering people for their own sake and not just because they may benefit me or bring me pleasure in some way, then I'm incapable of the highest love in this morality that you're describing if psychological egoism is true. And I'm incapable of it because all my motivations are ultimately about me if psychological egoism is true. So thinking through psychological egoism will form an important belief in my moral system, even though itself is not a moral system. Now, notice your beliefs on this issue also shape how you view the world and the motivations of other people. Indeed, you already have assumptions on this issue, and these assumptions color the way you view the actions and motives of other people. So it's time to think for yourself and examine the assumptions. As Socrates says, the unexamined life is not worth living. Okay, now hopefully that gives you a good sense for psychological egoism and why it's important. So let's turn to those promised three big arguments for it and evaluate those. Okay, the three arguments. So these three arguments are from Schaefer-Landau's The Fundamentals of Ethics, a great introductory to ethics book. It's the one I most recommend. Argument one is the argument from our strongest desires. Premise one, you can see it on the screen. Whenever you do something, you are motivated by your strongest desire. Premise 2, whenever you are motivated by your strongest desire, you are pursuing your self-interest. The conclusion, therefore, whenever you do something, you are pursuing your self-interest. Now, please don't get caught up in the vocabulary too much, but look at self-interest as having a motive that's ultimately about what you think is good for yourself. It's an egoistic motivation. Now, to evaluate this argument, we need to ask whether the first two premises are true, and then determine whether they provide good grounds for the conclusion. So we need to evaluate the two premises and the inference from the premises to the conclusion. So let's look at premise 1. Premise 1 says, whenever you do something, you are motivated by your strongest desire. At first, I might argue that this is false because, let's say Bob went to work even though he didn't want to. It seems like he's not motivated by his strongest desire. But the psychological egoist has a reply. The problem is Bob wanted to go to work because he wanted money. That is, he's acting on his strongest desire, which is a desire for money and the goods it makes possible. Now, there are many such examples in which people do what they don't want to do because there are deeper and stronger desires for money or harmony or something else. So these sorts of examples don't seem to be strong counters against premise 1. Premise 1 is good so far. So let's consider conscientious action. When you are acting conscientiously, your strongest desires pull you one way and your sense of duty pull you the other. So people sometimes follow their duty instead of their strongest desires. Now, of course, the egoist might say, well, perhaps their strongest desire is to do their duty. Maybe so. So premise 1 seems reasonable. But there's now a problem with premise 2. If you accept premise 1 for that reason, then it seems like you must now admit that the strongest desire is not always to benefit oneself, because the strongest desire is sometimes to do one's duty, which you believe may not always benefit yourself. Sometimes we most want to do our duty, even if it comes at personal cost. Premise 2 seems false because then our deepest desire is not always to benefit ourselves. Sometimes we want to do our duty even when it is at personal cost. So the egoist must insist that truly conscientious action does not exist. Right? Now, of course, people do help others and they claim to be acting from duty, but the egoist here must maintain that those who act according to duty are really just looking out for themselves. Now, perhaps such people are lying to themselves about acting for duty's sake. They're engaging in self-deception, self-flattery, right? Whatever, it's all about them. Now, these egoist arguments, though, they fail to show that conscientious action never occurs. Even if we can think of cases of conscientious action, and even if some of these actions are tainted by lies and self-deceptions and self-interest, we have no reason to think that all are. Not yet. Let's put it this way. Let's say premise 1 is true. So we always do what we most want to do. But this doesn't yet show that our strongest desires are always for personal gain. That's precisely what has to be proven. So look at premise 2 again. It says our strongest desires are always for personal gain. But those who believe in altruism will not accept that. Indeed, premise 2 begs the question because it assumes the truth of the conclusion that it's meant to support. Only those who already reject the existence of altruism will accept premise 2. Everyone else, the non-egoist, everyone else will think that our strongest desires may sometimes be for something other than self-interest or self-pleasure. So in classes, I often try to make this point. Premise 2 assumes that just because a desire is mine, it seems, it must have a certain object, me. The assumption is that it must be in my self-interest since it is my desire. Right? But whose desire it is and what it is for are completely different issues. The egoist is mistaken when he assumes that just because a desire is mine and it's strong, then it has to be aimed at my self-interest. Why couldn't it be aimed at the welfare of a friend or even a stranger? The ultimate aim. Just because I'm doing what I really want does not mean my desire is self-interested. And this is important. Just because I'm doing what I most want to do doesn't mean I'm self-interested. For all we know at this point, what I really want to do in some cases may be to benefit other people for their own sake, and not simply for the pleasure it may bring me or for some other benefit to me. That remains to be proven. It's just asserted right now. So when you think about, the egoist claim remains to be proven. It's just asserted. So when you think about selfish and self-interest and egoism, You must distinguish between desire and the object of desire. Very simple. So as Rachel writes in the Elements of Moral Philosophy, it's not that you desire that makes you self-interested or altruistic. It's what you desire that makes you self-interested or altruistic. And Joey really fails to make this distinction in the Friends episode, as do many egoists. But even if the egoist makes the distinction, they haven't proven, and here's the other important point, they haven't proven that the object of my desire, right, isn't sometimes and ultimately the good of another person and not simply myself or my pleasure. Another way of getting at the problem with the Friends episode with Joey is that, in classes I argue that the fact that I benefit from an action does not mean I did it for that benefit. I might get money after helping an old lady across the street, but it doesn't mean I did it to get the money. I may get pleasure after fulfilling my deepest desires, but it doesn't follow that I did it for that pleasure. I might get pleasure after donating that $5 for food for people, but it doesn't mean I did it for the pleasure. That's what the psychological egoist must prove, not assume. So in short, even if argument one's first premise sounds reasonable, the second premise seems to beg the question. We don't yet have a good reason to doubt the existence of altruistic motivation. So let's move to argument 2. Argument 2 overlaps with what a lot of what I just said, but it's still good to lay it out as Schaefer-Landau does in premise and conclusion form. So here it is. This is the argument from expected benefit. Premise 1, whenever you do something, you expect to be better off as a result. Premise 2, if you expect to be better off as a result of your actions, then you are aiming to promote your self-interest. And then the conclusion, number 3, is therefore, whenever you do something, you are aiming to promote your self-interest. Now, to evaluate this argument, let's examine the two premises and the inference from the two premises to the conclusion. Now, you could question premise 1 by arguing that pessimists don't expect to be better off as a result of their actions, or you could argue that the atheist who jumps on a grenade to save his peers does not expect to be better off as a result of jumping on the grenade. He's not acting in his self-interest because he's killing himself to save others. But the psychological egoist reminds us that appearances can be misleading. Let's say that deep down he believes his actions will make him better off, maybe in the afterlife or something. So let's assume that premise 1 is reasonable, even though I have serious doubts about it. Now again, it seems like the psychological egoist is begging the question in premise 2, which states that if you expect to be better off as a result of your action, then you're aiming to promote your self-interest. The problem with this egoist idea is that a volunteer may receive pleasure from her work, but it doesn't follow that she did it for that pleasure. This seems to be confusing consequence with motivation. My motive, my intention, in getting on an airplane is to get to my destination. It is not to burn gasoline. That's a mere consequence. A volunteer with all sincerity may claim that her aim is to help others rather than to help herself. It's nice then that she enjoys volunteering, but it's a side effect, a foreseen benefit, a consequence, and not the motive of her actions. This is what the volunteer may claim. Now again, the psychological egoist will surely argue that we can't be sure of the volunteer's sincerity. She may not even realize her true motive. And this is true. We cannot be sure of her motives or even our own motives, right? But that's not enough to prove psychological egoism is correct. Listing possible motives doesn't prove them true. To summarize, premise 2 is controversial because it claims that whenever we expect some benefit, our aim is to get that benefit. It seems there are counterexamples, although we can't be sure there really are. So given evidence that appears to undermine premise 2, the egoist needs to defend it, not just assert it. Now perhaps the egoist could modify premise 2 and argue that whenever you expect your action to result in X, then your aim is to get X. So if I expect money, pleasure, and fame for my actions, then that's why I do the action. If I expect personal gain, then my goal is to get it. But again, the problem with this modified version of premise 2 is that it's false. Schaefer-Landau states that whenever he lectures to a large audience, he expects some to fall asleep. But that's not his goal. If you play a professional basketball player, you might expect to lose, but that's probably not your goal. Maybe your goal is to enjoy the experience and learn a thing or two. If you don't study, you might expect to fail the exam, but it doesn't follow that your goal when taking the exam is to fail. So in short, expecting something doesn't always mean aiming for it. And this is a challenge to premise 2. Now, premise 2 might still be true, but we haven't seen any good reasons to think so. So this argument is not sound because the premises are quite dubious. Again, you can use what's been said here so far to show what's wrong with Joey's argument in the Friends episode. And if you aren't familiar with that Friends episode, you can YouTube Friends episode on psychological egoism, and you now have the tools to refute that argument. But let's go to argument 3, the argument from avoiding personal misery, or avoiding misery in general. Okay, the argument from avoiding misery. So premise 1, if we would never do an action that promised only personal misery, then all of our actions are done in an effort to avoid such misery. Premise 2, we would never do an action that promised only personal misery. And the conclusion, number 3, therefore all of our actions are done in an effort to avoid misery, personal misery. And that is, of course, a self-interested motivation. So egoism is true. However, notice premise 1 takes this form. If I would never do an action that promised me only X, then I am always trying to avoid X. The egoist says that we wouldn't do actions that promised only misery, therefore we are always trying to avoid misery. Our motivation is that. And, of course, avoiding misery is self-interested, so we're always motivated by self-interest. But there are problems with this premise and general principle. For example, I would never do an action if it guaranteed me only 1,000 bee stings or permanent bankruptcy. This doesn't mean that I'm always trying to avoid these things. It's not my motive when I'm washing the dishes or preparing a meal. So even if we wouldn't do an action if it promised only misery, it just doesn't follow that our motivations are always to avoid such misery. So premise 1 is problematic, and that's one major problem with this argument. It just seems false, actually. Now, maybe you can identify other problems, okay, if you look at the premise 2. Okay, but let's move on to this guilty conscience idea. So whenever I give examples of heroes killing themselves to save others, some students argue that they're doing it because they don't want to live with a guilty conscience. For example, the guy that jumped in a grenade did so because it's better to die than to live with the guilt of not saving his buddies. So the egoist argues he's self-interested because he's avoiding a life of suffering from a guilty conscience. It's still all about him, right? Now, again, there are many problems with this egoist argument. First, a good person will be troubled at the thought of doing wrong, but that doesn't prove that her actions are motivated by desire for a guilt-free conscience. Indeed, if she didn't care about others, then we shouldn't lose a wink of sleep at night, or she wouldn't lose a wink of sleep at night at the thought of their misery, right? So those who suffer pains of guilt when harming others or having missed a chance to help them are precisely those who care about other people. The initial evidence suggests that they are truly concerned with the welfare of others and not simply pleasuring themselves. The psychological egoist has not yet given us a good reason to doubt this. So those who are subject to guilt have altruistic concerns. If they didn't, they wouldn't feel so bad when failing to help others in need. Now, are they caring for others just for a benefit for themselves? I don't know. The psychological egoist certainly hasn't proved this yet. Now, of course, the guilty conscience criticism, it also seems problematic because, again, listing possible motives doesn't prove them true. And again, there's a difference between motive and consequence. The fact that a guilty conscience may be a consequence does not make it their motive. You have to prove that, not just show that they feel guilty. Again, I may be troubled at doing wrong, but how do you prove I did right solely to avoid being troubled, right? So in the science section, we'll see that one scientist, Batson, has tried to prove that, but his study indicated otherwise. He now rejects psychological egoism. Okay, so let's get to the verdict here before we get to the scientific evidence. Okay, so the verdict. Can we really know whether egoism or non-egoism is true? How do we know what ultimately motivates all people, much less ourselves? Now, I would say at the outset here that it seems like the burden of proof is on the egoist because they're making a positive claim about all people and all their motivations. And the initial evidence is against psychological egoism. There's altruistic counterexamples, right? The non-egoist is making a weaker claim about some motives. So that's interesting to keep in mind. Now, Russ Schaefer Landau, like many ethicists, argues that we should let the evidence decide. So people often report that they try to help others even at personal cost. Now, the egoist doesn't believe it. The egoist believes that such people are self-deceived or trying to deceive others. The egoist believes everyone is acting from self-interest. But as we've seen, there is evidence against egoism. There's personal testimony, I did this because. And there's apparently altruistic actions motivated by altruistic motivations, like people who jump on grenades or give to charity and so on. And the replies the egoists have given so far are weak. And remember, they're making a claim about all human motivation, not some. And their arguments have problems and so on. So for the egoists, I think a deeper question should be asked. Is your thesis testable, falsifiable? Is there any evidence in theory that would prove your belief in egoism false? We have seen that you, the egoist, discount the testimony of supposedly altruistic acts, and you list possible self-interested motives and then say they're probably true, without proving that they're true, right? If there's nothing that in theory would disprove your belief in egoism, then it's not a very rational belief. It's not supported by evidence. It's what you use to interpret all evidence. So, on the other hand, let's say that you're a psychological egoist and you're open to testing egoism. When you look at the actions and the testimonies of people, then the evidence is clearly against psychological egoism. People claim to sometimes act altruistically, and behaviors confirm this. There's also scientific confirm it to some degree, right? We can't really know the ultimate motives, it seems. But the evidence seems to confirm altruism more strongly than egoism. Now, there's also scientific evidence against egoism nowadays, and we'll look at it in just a minute. So the point is that if the egoist is open to counter evidence, then they should not be very confident in their position because there's a lot of counter evidence. From one initial perspective, psychological egoism seems plausible. After all, it seems realistic, and we all know that many supposedly altruistic acts often have self-interested motives. It appeals to the cynic in some of us, and perhaps too it conforms to some superficial idea we have about biology. I'll get to that later. But when you examine the arguments and evidence for psychological egoism, it seems it's probably false. I may not be a saint, but I'm not entirely self-absorbed either. And this means it's possible for me to become better, more altruistic, more generous, shifting my own attention from my own needs to the needs of others. Perhaps I can even aspire to losing all sense of self, as the mystics and the Buddhists describe. So from the Buddhist perspective, or at least some Buddhists, can I be self-interested if I have no self? Or if I seek the destruction of myself? It's such a paradox, right? Whatever the case, it seems people are sometimes altruistic, and so psychological egoism is probably false. Although the arguments and counter examples that the egoists provide are flawed, it's important to realize that egoism may nevertheless be true, but I doubt it. Right? Now, again, there's this interesting objection to psychological egoism that sometimes arises before we get to more distinctions. So notice many traditions speak of the dissolution of the self or outline a doctrine of no self. The Buddhists and the mystics in every culture do this. Jesus and Paul speak of the death of self and the rebirth of a new self, where this new self is capable of a higher, more altruistic love. So is this sort of philosophy or religion compatible with psychological egoism? How can we seek the good of the self if there is no self? How can we seek the good of the self if one goal is to let the illusion of self melt away? How can egoism be true if the highest love is possible? And this is a very interesting way to critique psychological egoism. Okay, let's move on here. Okay, let me quickly review these distinctions on the slide before we get into the scientific evidence for and against. The first distinction that you should be able to explain is between the source of the desire and the object of the desire. It's a very important distinction to make, even though it doesn't ultimately solve the psychological egoism issue. So make sure you can explain that. Okay, again, the fact that a desire comes from me is not what makes it selfish or self-interested. It's the object of the desire, right? Number two, you want to distinguish between the aim of the motive and the ultimate aim of the motive, right? So the aim of my motive might be to go to the dentist, while the ultimate aim is to have healthy teeth. So to be fair to egoism, you definitely want to make that distinction, but also to be fair to the non-egoists, as we we'll see in the next section, and hopefully you see by now. The number 3, there seems to be a difference between pleasure and satisfaction. So let's say a monk sets himself on fire to protest a political injustice. The monk is not seeking like pleasure in the sense of a dopamine release in his brain. He's seeking the satisfaction of his goals. So it would be too crude and simplistic to argue that we're always seeking pleasure in the sense of a dopamine release or that sort of thing, a chemical reaction in the brain. You know, he's on fire, for Pete's sake. So the refined egoist wants to argue that he's seeking the satisfaction of his goals, and that's why he's self-interested and egoistic, because they bring him pleasure or satisfaction, not because you know, he's seeking some chemical thing. So now, does that really make him self-interested? As we've seen, no, not necessarily, because his goals are not all about himself. Rather, they're about helping other people live in peace. The fact that he's lighting himself on fire to achieve his goals doesn't make him self-interested, precisely because the object of his desires may not simply be his own welfare or his own pleasure. Self-interest is not about seeking satisfaction or fulfilling goals. It's about what you take satisfaction in, or what types of goals you're fulfilling or seeking as the ultimate end, right? Now, how do we really know what's motivating them? How do you know the deepest motives of others? Well, I sure hope science can help. We'll see in the next section, right? Okay, but on the surface, it seems like there are altruistic actions, as we saw in the previous section. The next distinction is there's a difference between consequence and motivation. Go back if you're confused by that. Number 5, here's an interesting thought experiment from Louis Poyman. Let's say you get great pleasure in playing the piano. A scientist then offers you a pill that will give you greater pleasure your entire life, but the catch is that your hands will be distorted so you can no longer play the piano. So what would you do? Take the pill, get more pleasure, or continue playing the piano? Now, if pleasure is all that matters, surely you would take the pill. But would you take the pill? Is pleasure really all that matters, or something like pleasure, whatever we're talking about here? Do you value reality and excellence and goodness for themselves and not just for the pleasure they might bring? It's a very interesting discussion that might tie into some of what we're discussing, but it's somewhat of a digression, right? Here's distinction 6. We want to avoid false dilemmas, right? So can some acts and some motives even be both egoistic and altruistic at the same time? Does the egoist commit a false dilemma when he argues that all acts are either self-interested entirely or altruistic entirely, and that all must be self-interested since altruism is impossible? Okay, again, imagine a soldier jumps on the grenade. That act seems highly altruistic. Now imagine the soldier throws the grenade away out in the distance to save himself and other people. Is he seeking to save himself as well as others? Well, yeah. Doesn't that have shades of both altruism and egoism in the act? What if he runs away and doesn't warn anyone? That seems to be an act that's very self-interested, not very altruistic, right? So how should that be categorized? And when he throws the grenade, does he have one motive to save the self and others, or does he have two separate motives? And so these actions cause us to speculate more and more on the motives, and we don't know for sure, right? But again, the evidence seems to be against egoism on the surface. Okay, so let's go to distinction 7. If psychological egoism is true, then both Gandhi and Hitler are equally self-interested, right? According to psychological egoism, altruism is impossible. Every human motivation is about what is good for me. So the serial killer and the saint may disagree about what's good for me, but neither transcends the ultimate motive of benefiting me, according to egoism, right? I may be selfish or self-interested or egoistic, but the psychological egoist believes it's all about the self in the end. So does this fit well with your understanding of self-interest, individual welfare, and altruism? And again, this is an interesting consequence of psychological egoism. To develop a morality based on egoism, one would have to argue that it's better to seek one's self-interest by helping others than to seek one's self-interest by harming others. And that's precisely what some people do. That's why Thomas Hobbes is an egoist at heart. All right? According to psychological egoism, there's no room in morality for seeking another's good for their own sake. And there's no room in morality for seeking to sacrifice one's ultimate self-interest for another's sake, because such acts are impossible according to the psychological egoist. So do you agree with that? All right, it's very interesting to think about. Now, number 8, you want to review this again. Whatever you believe about psychological egoism, is your belief testable? Can you imagine what evidence would make it false if it were false? If not, then is your belief really reasonable, or is it more like a prejudice? Are you getting your belief in egoism from the evidence, or are you using egoism to interpret all the evidence? If you cannot even imagine what would count as evidence against your belief for or against egoism, then you're probably not thinking about this issue as deeply as you think you are. So consider the evidence mentioned earlier, or the Batson research in the description box below, the science. Again, he begins by exploring the theoretical evidence that would make egoism false if it were false, and then sets up tests. It's very interesting. Number 9, listing motives doesn't make them true. Okay, make sure you can explain that. Number 10, notice that the egoist plays the game of listing possible egoist motives for every apparently altruistic motive, like the grenade example. The non-egoist also plays the game. They may take an apparently self-interested act, like shooting an innocent prisoner in time of war. Why didn't the soldier refuse to obey orders? Well, perhaps it wasn't to save himself. Maybe it was to save his family, who would most likely suffer greatly if they were imprisoned for following orders. And maybe he wasn't doing it for a pleasure at all for himself. It was very painful and a complete sacrifice. How do we know the deepest motivations of each person? And then finally, number 11, many traditions speak of the dissolution of self, or outline a doctrine of no self, right? Buddhists and mystics. So is this sort of philosophy or religion compatible with egoism, psychological egoism? How can we seek the good of the self if there is no self? How can we seek the good of the self if one goal is to let the illusion of self melt away? All right, let's get to the science. Okay, so the science. Before getting into the scientific research, I'll just address some arguments or ideas that people present that seem to be based on some understanding or misunderstanding of science, okay, to support egoism and so on. Okay, so question 1, doesn't biology and evolution prove that we're always selfish or self-interested or egoistic? And the answer is no, it proves the opposite. So biologists are constantly describing altruistic behavior in animals and how natural selection gives rise to cooperation and altruism. Batson notes that, quote, evolutionary biologists speak of altruism across a very broad phylogenetic spectrum ranging from social insects to humans. However, it's important, and that's the end of the quote, now it's important to recognize that the meaning of altruism in biology is different from the meaning of altruism in psychology and philosophy, right? So, let's see, Sober, Wilson, and Batson write the following. It's important to distinguish evolutionary altruism and psychological altruism. Evolutionary altruism is behavior that reduces one's reproductive fitness. Psychological altruism is motivation with the ultimate goal of increasing another's welfare. So psychological egoism is about human motives, not animal behavior. It's about why we choose to act as human beings, not what we subconsciously desire or automatically do, or behavior alone. So psychologists and philosophers are focused on psychological egoism. We're interested in what consciously motivates you. We know from biology that there are altruistic behaviors, but what's in question in this whole video, this whole debate, is whether there's altruistic motivation in humans. Now, many people get confused on this issue because Richard Dawkins titled one of his books, The Selfish Gene, right? But it's important to recognize that Dawkins was using a metaphor. Genes are not actually selfish in a conscious, motivational sense. Indeed, if you listen to Dawkins carefully, he seems to be actually against psychological egoism, and he's more focused on the origins and evolutionary explanations for the urges or the strong desires that we feel. So at one point in an interview, Dawkins says, "This is the antidote some have seen in our Darwinian heritage. The joy of being conscious human beings is that we rise above our origins. Our misfiring selfish genes mean we don't ape the nastiness of nature, but extract ourselves from it and live by our values." So not only is Dawkins not arguing that genes are consciously selfish, but he's arguing that humans can rise above some urges or the evolutionary purpose of these urges and choose our values, whether they be altruistic or egoistic values. So based on what I've seen here in his interviews, Dawkins does not seem to be an egoist in the psychological sense. Right? And I'll put a link in the bottom so you can look at that for yourself. Question 2. If all motives are caused by natural selection, aren't all motives self-interested since they arise from the desire to survive? The answer is no. There's no reason natural selection could not give rise to empathy, cooperation, altruistic motivation. We already know it gives rise to altruistic behavior. Also, it does not follow that all life forms are seeking survival simply because they are selected based on their ability to survive. A Nazi may choose to kill me, but it doesn't follow that I'm therefore motivated by a Nazi principle. So this is one of many points that Dawkins struggles to explain in the interviews. And finally, this debate is not about whether the forces of nature determine our motivations. It's about whether we're ever consciously motivated to increase another's welfare for their own sake and not just our own. The issue of free will and determinism is a red herring in this debate. But let's address that. Next question. If you don't have free will, aren't you always self-interested? And again, this doesn't follow. The debate is not about free will and determinism. The debate is about human motivation, whether any motivations are directed towards another's welfare. So consider this example. Let's say we create conscious robots. An exclusively self-interested robot may want to steal in some cases because it's been programmed that way. An altruistic robot, on the other hand, will help others and show reverence for life because it's programmed to want that. The fact that both robots are programmed and deterministically acting, does not make both self-interested. Only the first robot is self-interested because only the first is excessively concerned with his own interest. The second may even sacrifice himself to help others survive. His ultimate aim, in other words, is not the preservation of self, or bringing self-pleasure, but the fulfillment of goals that benefit others, not himself. So in short, we could theoretically program robots to be self-interested or altruistic or a combination of both, if we can program them to have motives at all. Perhaps the aliens from Arlopskop, who created us, did just that, right? So in short, the philosophical and psychological question is about the nature of human motivation. It's not about whether the motivation or desires are determined. Okay, number 14. If I know I'm always self-interested, can I infer everyone is always self-interested? And of course, no, that's a hasty generalization fallacy. I may be angry, but it doesn't follow that everyone is angry. So it's inflacious to infer that everyone has the same types of motivations that you do. The fundamental question then is, well, how do you really know the motives of other people? Again, we believe they have certain motives based on their testimony and actions, but the psychological egoist believes all motives are ultimately self-interested. How can they possibly know that? When we examine their arguments, they're fallacious. When we look at the science, it supports altruism more than psychological egoism. So my tentative conclusion is that, I wouldn't just say tentative, 80, 90, 100%, not quite 100% sure, is that psychological egoism is probably false. It's often an ideological position. It's not a position you get from the evidence alone. It's a position you use to interpret all the evidence. Of course, I'll keep following the literature, and I'm open to new data that proves it's stronger than the alternative, right? Okay, question 15, or the next question, let's call it that. Haven't psychologists and economists proven that all human actions and motivations are self-interested? Don't they use this fact to construct models and make predictions? And I'll just say, no, they have not proven everyone is egoistic or self-interested. They assumed it. If their predictions are fairly reliable, we can infer people usually act self-interestedly. However, we cannot infer people are always self-interested from the fact that some psychologists and economists assume they are. Also, the predictions are never perfect. Why? For example, they may predict that the prisoners will turn on each other and do whatever is necessary for survival. But then 5% of the prisoners don't align with these predictions. Could it be that 5% of them are acting altruistically instead of from self-interest alone? This is exactly what I think when I read of historical accounts of the Holocaust, like Frankel's Man's Search for Meaning or Browning's Ordinary Men. So in my reasoned and experienced opinion, there are always some who seem to choose the altruistic action, even if most choose the self-interested one. Psychological egoism again seems false. So finally, what is the scientific evidence? Well, I'm providing a link in the box below from Daniel Batson. He's a psychologist who studied this issue for 30 years. You can read his article below. It's called Empathy-Induced Altruistic Motivation. In his book, The Altruism Question Towards a Social Psychological Answer, summarizes his research. Now, Batson begins with a confession. He started the research with an egoism bias. He thought that altruism was a myth, and he wanted to prove it. But to his surprise, the experiments countered his bias. He now believes altruism exists and that egoism, psychological egoism, is false. So he begins his paper with a really clear definition of altruism and egoism. You can read below. So again, altruism is a motivational state with the ultimate goal of increasing another's welfare, and egoism is a motivational state with the ultimate goal of increasing one's own welfare. And he spends a few pages clarifying these. He then explains how we can empirically determine a person's motivations. He notes that we cannot trust self-reports about motivations, but we can infer motives from behavior, he says. So if a behavior is consistent with more than one motive, then we simply need more observations. So for example, let's say I believe Sally asked me out on a date not long after I won the lottery. Let's say that happened. In this case, Sally has many possible motives. She may really like me, right? She may be suffering from brain damage, or she may want to get my money, right? The possible motives are endless. But I can narrow them down by observing her behavior in new situations, right? So on our first date, I could tell her I did not win the lottery, or I gave it all to charity. If she dumps me immediately after I tell her this, I can infer that she was probably, right? It's highly likely that she was probably interested in the money, not me. So her behavior in this situation, I should say ultimately interested in the money, not me. So her behavior in this situation and others will help determine her motives, right? So psychologists like Batson set up experiments to infer motives from actions, and they need to set up experiments in which both altruistic and egoistic motivations are possible. They then vary the situation to narrow down the motives, right? And again, the research is below, and Batson concludes in the end that, yeah, psychological egoism is probably false. There are cases there are cases where people sometimes act altruistically for the good of another's welfare, not for the pleasure it brings them, not for some self-interested good they can get from helping them, but for the other's welfare. Now, this entire discussion is not about morality, nor does it make any assumptions about morality, right? Psychological egoism is a descriptive thesis in debate. We've explored whether it's reasonable to believe everyone is always self-interested or not, right? But we have not explored whether it's good or bad to be self-interested, some or most or all the time. Now, although this is not a moral debate, your answer to psychological egoism does have consequences for how you think about morality, as we saw earlier. So in the end, many people seem to believe it's just obvious that everyone is always self-interested. But upon further investigation, we find strong logical, philosophical, and even scientific evidence that shows that psychological egoism is implausible. Just as the sun does not revolve around the earth, so the objects of my desires and motivations are not always about me or my pleasure. Thank you.